Welcome to, once again, the Territories Lecture Series of the Knowlton School of Architecture. Tonight we're very pleased to have Pierre Bélanger, Associate Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, speaking with us. I think Pierre is particularly appropriate for the Territories series, both geographically and ideologically. Geographically is rather obvious. Up until this year, Pierre was on the faculty of the University of Toronto, and quite a bit of his work had to do with the study of urbanism, patterns, populations based around the Great Lakes region, an area that we, in a large sense, share. Ideologically, the territory that Pierre has been working in recently is one of emerging importance in not just landscape architecture, but in the cross-disciplinary endeavor that landscape planning, architecture, urbanism share. Pierre is one of a handful of emerging critics in our field who are working toward establishing intellectual terrain at the intersection of these fields. I think it's interesting also that Pierre is joining the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Design right at the moment where the landscape department there is redefining itself for the first time in about a generation. So territorially, he is going to be playing an increasingly important role in one of our major educational institutions. And in talking to Pierre, I think he's very cognizant of that fact. He has stated to me that it's really the pedagogy of his work as much as the expression of it through design or through publication that interests him. Some issues that I see in his work that are particularly pressing to us at this time, and perhaps why this kind of work is relevant, is that he approaches infrastructure or things related to the conceptualization of it through a lens of clearly urbanization, but also post-urbanization, the contemporary state of the city, through our current economies, both financial and environmental, the overlap between the two, obviously, and through a renewed focus on public works that we find particularly in the US at this point in time. And an idea that public works, once again, or perhaps in a new way, is operating both as civil terrain and civic terrain. Pierre is the author of numerous articles, essays, and chapters across journals in landscape architecture, but in planning and engineering. He is an award-winning designer. He's a recipient of the Canadian Prize 2009 Rome Prize, in which he described to me, I said, "Oh, so you went to Rome?" He said, "No, you have to go to Rome, but ... And I said, you have to go to Rome? Well, that's just terrible." He was a recipient of this prestigious prize last year. He's the founder of the nonprofit federally funded Landscape Infrastructure Lab, working at on private-public projects. And he is registered in Ontario as a surface miner, certified to operate heavy machinery. So hopefully we'll see some of that tonight. Pierre, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jane. It's really nice to be here, and I appreciate the crowd that's here. I hope you'll bear with me, because this evening what I'm hoping to do is to be able to introduce a series of conditions in which I've been trying to understand how to be able to work both as first as a pedagogue, number two as a researcher, number three as a planner, number four as a designer, and number five as an implementer. I'm interested in all of those things. My work really deals with primarily with the Great Lakes region, but also expands upon notions dealing with the North American pattern of urbanization. I'll emphasize that because in many respects, not too long ago, I found myself in your shoes, either as an undergraduate or a graduate student, where certain questions were arising in terms of the inherited knowledge that was being provided from what could be said as being European sources of knowledge, or as I formulated them for myself in my own work, knowledge from the old world. The talk this evening is essentially organized in a couple of portions here. I'm just going to introduce a few of the projects and the scales at which I'm working and involved with an organization. I'll talk very briefly about some of the work that I'm involved at the Graduate School of Design, and then do a two-part, it's really a two-part lecture that is retrospective in terms of going back 150 years to be able to reformulate some ideas, and then going forward to try to understand how do we position ourselves today as designers, planners, vis-a-vis major infrastructural change that is occurring. There's two things that I think are noteworthy in terms of the work that's being done right now at the Graduate School of Design that I'm involved in right now. I essentially have stepped into the shoes of Carl Steinitz when he retired this past spring. I've been literally forced into a position to be able to not only fill in those fairly large shoes, but also, more importantly, to be able to understand how do we rethink planning. You'll notice the title of the presentation itself is reformulated in terms of both an understanding of defining or redefining infrastructure, but also to be able to understand whatever happened to planning itself, and I'll try to define that. I run one course that deals with landscape planning for the 21st century. We take a look at a number of paradigms, namely the more current one of sustainability. But more importantly, what we try to do is take a look at large-scale processes over large periods of time to be able to understand how there's large-scale practices that are repositioning our practices towards a more regional understanding. The second thing that I'm involved in is, and this is an interest and an understanding that I'm trying to gain through the studios that I teach at the Graduate School of Design. We're now enlisting a series of military sites that are being decommissioned across America amidst a continental restructuring that's occurring throughout the nation. Not just the US, but in fact is happening in Canada as well. In the post-Cold War period, as well as the lead up to more contemporary wars in the 21st century, there is reorganization of military bases, both of decommissioning and restructuring that's occurring. This map simply shows that. I have a bit of a special relationship with Columbus that I didn't share with Jane yet, because in many respects, at the precise moment that I thought my career was failing, there was actually recognition for a project here with the competition for that was called Columbus Rewired for a number of intersections throughout the city. And in fact, this photograph represents one of the parts of the competition project itself, which was a total experiment. But here's what was happening. I'd been involved in a number of competition from within the discipline of landscape architecture, and it was failing. It was going nowhere. There was being no recognition for the work, and either I was in an academic position and had no idea what I was doing, or there was another alternative, which was to actually jump fields and actually start to propose the same ideas somewhere else. Looking back 3 or 4 years back, the Columbus Rewired was actually, in fact, a turning point for the competition itself. We won a small prize, but actually, more importantly, it was actually recognition for an idea that we were trying to contemplate, which was the idea of counter-urbanism or disurbanism, which is a significant idea that I carry through the talk, which is essentially an alternative to understanding growth, economic growth as a parameter of urbanization, and we always associate it with growing economic conditions, growing cities, growing density. And my work is primarily interested in actually re-questioning whether or not economic growth is necessarily needs to be a factor of density and growing urban conditions. This project essentially looked at a series of possibilities and essentially boils down to, you can see here, part of the project, this is the existing intersection that was reworked with this high-speed train system. Essentially, we explored all different forms of collective and communal systems of urbanization. And that was just a research project that was associated with the design, which dealt at looking how there was a history of understanding the evolution of intersections throughout Columbus, ranging from the first one with the confluence of the river, and then at High Street, and then an evolution of the cul-de-sac itself as an intersection, the interchange, the airport as a major interchange, and then we situated our project within that evolution. I'll just make a point here that research itself is paired one-to-one, if not sometimes more important than the design work, because in many respects, a poorly researched project leads to over-designing it, and a well-researched project leads to, most of the time, an under-designed and precisely designed project, in my opinion. This was just a timeline associated with the work. This actually led us to some confidence, leading to a number of other competitions. This is for the Venice Lagoon competition that was juried by a number of practitioners like James Corner. That was put together by 2G. It was a competition for the redesign of an island in the middle of the Venice Lagoon, and instead of giving them a park, we gave them a lagoon strategy. And essentially what it dealt with is finding a way to be able to reclaim and rebuild the lagoon, which essentially was close to being dead. This is just some of the research associated with the project itself in terms of understanding how do you actually rebuild lagoon ecology, and how do you actually start with the basic building blocks of fish and aquatic species. I'll just bring in one last project dealing with competitions, which is a very early one from about 7 years ago, which we thought at that point was a total failure. This was a competition project for a new highway system signage standard. It was put forth by the Cooper Union, and they were essentially looking for new signage possibilities and strategies. But what we did is we did a research project over the past 150 years to be able to understand how patterns of urbanization, or I'm sorry, I'll reverse engineer this, how signage, if you look at it through history and the buildup of that signage typology, matches forms of either intersections or urbanization that are then based on certain types of urban ideologies. And the conclusion to all this was essentially that we led up to the point, and you can see the history of highway systems through the actual types of signs. The conclusion to all this is that in the end, you have an abundance of signage that makes the road itself, as the structure of urbanism, completely invisible. So we asked the question, could we not rethink this morphology and actually get rid of this? We came across a great Dutch civil engineer who was thinking exactly the same way. And the method to be able to redress complicated interchanges and signage associated with it is actually with roundabout interchanges. And so essentially what we did is we went a little bit further into detail. We took one interchange in Los Angeles as a case study and essentially proposed a series of land uses for the roundabout itself. These are just a few examples associated with it. There literally are urbanism associated with it. Now these projects might seem a little bit ridiculous, but or as experiments from a landscape perspective, but they make sense in terms of the following. A close colleague of mine, who is the director of the Jardin de Métis in Quebec, who runs the Garden Festival, which is in eastern Quebec, approached me regarding a $45 million interchange that we're looking to build at the end of the Trans-Canada Highway. I think you could situate yourself here in terms of the East Coast and the Great Lakes and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And essentially, they were planning the last interchange to complete the Canadian highway system at the very end. It occupies a very important geographic position because it's a loop, what they call la boucle de la Gaspésie, the loop of the Gaspésie, which is almost approximately 1,000-kilometer drive around that peninsula. It's got great connections also to the East Coast. That intersection marks an important point, but that interchange was designed in the 1970s, and this was essentially the four-leaf cloverleaf you can see in red. This is three-leaf, and they were essentially going to build the fourth one later on. But essentially they had the money, they had the drawings, they had the right-of-way cleared for the entire interchange. It was literally at the 11th hour, and we were asked to put a proposal together in terms of an alternative, in terms of reorganizing this spaghetti interchange. We got completely laughed out of the water by civil engineers that have been working on this for 25 years and couldn't wait for this highway to get built with their interchange. They chuckled at our laser cut models, our diagrams, said that it was completely imprecise, despite the fact that I had a civil engineering student working with me. We put together this kind of plan to be able to reorganize both this regional center as well as this local urban condition, which bordered on an airport, a small town, and then also this is the road that goes around that big loop. 2.5 years later, we receive this newspaper clipping. Essentially says a roundabout or gyratory junction, as it's called, at the end of the highway. It's getting built. Luckily, there's another Pierre, who's another architect, who's actually getting, I think he was getting a project for a tourist center within the roundabout. My name is not there. And that happens a lot, because I'm involved in multi-year projects that involve a lot of people, and most of the time they deal with conceptual thinking. At very early on stages, and is at that precise point that we received that newspaper clipping, and just last year when we received aerial photographs of that roundabout itself. And it may not seem to you as being on the platform of high design, but I'd like to posit this, is that for us, it began to open up a practice of being able to be at the front end of design and planning and engineering. That was a turning point in the organization I'm involved in. It was a turning point because then we had other organizations approaching us, like the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, with a project that they were looking to undertake. This is the Pearson International Airport in Toronto, with a project that they were undertaking dealing with the watershed of the Etobicoke and Mimico Creek, which is one of the most industrialized watersheds bordering on Lake Ontario that drains into Lake Ontario. And what they were looking to do is reduce the amount of pervious surfaces on the airport lands, but also the industries that are zoned and spin off of the activities associated with the airport. Nobody wanted to do this project because it was so incredibly banal, they couldn't find landscape architects to do this. Too small, too banal, too little money. Involved parking lots and ridiculously dumb diagrams that we actually started developing this idea of these precise diagrams to be able to show both to the public as well as to clients, as well as to engineers. These are just small cross sections dealing with some of the surfaces that get revamped. But we're essentially using the platform, well, or the mantle that Henry Ford kind of enlisted a few years ago, which was a million small little changes can make a mega difference. We suggested things like mowing regimes, curb cuts to be able to take drainage systems offline and drain them into infiltration pits, as well as what it turned out to be more of an educational program to clients to be able to understand how to neglect their sites. Most of the projects that we're involved in deal with a form of protracted neglect, controlled neglect. And this is one of the sites, for example, that we're working on. This is Pratt & Whitney that build aircraft engines. What we do is we develop a hydrometric for the entire site itself. We calculate the amount of surface area, how much drains off of it based on precipitation, how much are their water needs, and then we understand how can the cover of pervious surfaces be transformed to either retain it, infiltrate it, or even possibly recirculate it. It turns into these fairly, again, banal images that are proposed to clients, but in fact what they do is actually disguise recirculation systems for water. So for example, water catchment areas. The goal for most of the projects is for retention 65 to 85% on site. These sites also, because they're in proximity to the, or they're in the airport, the air shed of the airport, There is less of a visible presence on the roads. This is less important. This visibility of the front of the corporate industrial landscape that they are on, and rather the rooftops are actually much more important. So this is a small strategy that we're developing. Again, this is just a photograph that shows the airport within the watershed basin of the Etobicoke and Mimico Creek. Those are all the projects I'm going to show, because what I'd like to do is actually get into the actual, this retrospection. I'd just like to bring in a couple of publications that I think are useful to be able to preface the talk. One is in the Landscape Journal, a publication titled Landscape as Infrastructure, which is a text that took a good 5 or 6 years to write, which then led to a symposium that was held last year entitled Landscape Infrastructures. There was really 5 main points that I'd like to bring up about that publication, which start to deal with understanding of really 5 things. The first is the issue of urbanism also entails the process of de-urbanization. This is a photograph of Youngstown, where there is a general deindustrialization process and a vacancy not unlike Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland. But what's interesting is that there's a general decommissioning of different aspects of the infrastructure that supports these urban blocks, ranging from the sidewalks to the lamp standards, to the electricity, to the water, and also, in some cases, the streets. That there needs to be a systemic understanding associated with urbanization through recuperation of its waste, and that cities themselves produce organic waste that is in fact a resource. And when we recuperate that waste resource, there are a series of spin-off industries associated with it. The fourth aspect from that publication is that there are global forces that are beyond the control of certain regions, but have to be understood. This is, in fact, the research that Jane had mentioned from the Prix de Rome is probably going to be finished by next year, dealing with the influence and impact of the global land grab. There is a second round of almost imperial-style purchasing of land of host countries, of other countries, such as in Africa, India, and South Asia, for agricultural land from countries that don't have enough soil to produce their own food. The reason why it's happening now is because of the spike in oil prices as of 2006 and 2005. And finally, the one aspect about the publication that is important and raised the question that we tried to address in the symposium itself is how one can actually start to understand how the process of urbanization need to be reconciled and need to repatriate the biophysical systems that actually underlie them. And at the intersection of that is the question about infrastructure. That's where we come to the talk, and what I'd like to do to frame, let's frame and establish the gamut of what we're going to address here. And to be able to understand the proper point of departure is that there's 2 questions that we're asking right now in terms of the discussion about infrastructure. Why is it that in terms of the design practices right now, that the whole field of infrastructure itself, as a field, is not addressed as a practice within the design disciplines? And I'll substantiate by the fact that I'll throw out that essentially that civil engineers have been the preeminent practitioners of the 20th century that have trumped architects, landscape architects, planners put together. And the premise is that if we don't pay attention, they'll continue to do so. This is, for example, information taken from a poll by a Canadian company. This is a Canadian poll by Léger Marketing in terms of the most reliable and trusted professions in Canada. And of course, you could expect firefighters and then engineers at 88%, and go down the list. What's not on the list are designers. I contacted the company in many respects, and It was essentially a problem in understanding or defining whether or not designers were actually professionals. Number two thing that went literally unnoticed, and this is alarming, is that the largest landscape planning firm in the world got bought out and was acquired by the largest civil engineering company in the world. EDA merged with AECOM. Now, I spoke with Joe Brown, who's the CEO of EDA, and asked him this very same question, why nobody took notice. He mentioned that, in fact, there has been a little bit of notice separately by the disciplines, but nobody understands the repercussions of this. The repercussions is understanding that landscape planning itself possibly might be the critical missing link to the future of civil engineering in the 21st century. That's what the implication is. However, there's a good possibility here, understanding that Joe Brown, and this is what's even more alarming and has not been noticed, Joe Brown, small town landscape architect, landscape planner, as he defines himself, has risen to become the CEO and president of EDA, and is now going to be overseeing the entire design group at AECOM, which involves architecture, engineering, planning, and urban design. And what he's going to do is collapse all those fields and make them work together in a collaborative way. There's three aspects that we need to address in terms of understanding what is our point of departure in terms of redefining infrastructure now that we understand that it is an important field of practice. The next few minutes will be organized around three sections. We're going to talk about less about ideology and theory about infrastructure, and we're going to actually talk about facts. We're going to talk about a series of conflicts and failures from which infrastructure actually emerged. We're going to talk about two processes of urbanization and regionalization from which infrastructure actually was developed, and then we'll be able to draw a series of conclusions from a series of indicators today. I'll start, and what we do, our point of departure in this discussion, we're going to be in the turn of the 20th century. We're going to start around 1920s, and the reason for that is that there's a series of conflicts and failures that happen, and also, very importantly, the Mississippi flood that happens in 1927, where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is brought in to be able to, and brought in with a federal mandate in 1927 to work with the Mississippi River Commission to deal with the levees and the lands and the floodplain around the Mississippi itself. The word infrastructure appears at this very precise moment in North America. And what it refers to is this collective system, networks that deal with 5 aspects: national food security, drainage systems, ground transportation, centralized energy, and continental defense. Those aspects are important to retain throughout our discussion. We'll revisit those near the end. 2 events happened. The Mississippi flood in 1927, and we understand that based on the operations, the field of operations that were happening, and this was under Hoover, that there was a series of dynamiting of dikes, breaking of dikes to be able to avoid the imminent flooding of New Orleans downstream. There was residual impact that was occurred, but what's useful in this event is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, before it was actually named that, it was called the Civil Corps of Topographic Engineers. And the implications that in fact their work was related to the ground, was related to earthworks, is particularly operative in this discussion. Number 2 event that occurs, and this is by coincidence, is in 1927. There's an important court case that emerges, which is the village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Property. And this is just actually up the road from you. This is just a suburb of Cleveland. Lake Erie is right up here. And essentially the court case involved the injunction of a village that was looking to stop an industrial development beside a neighborhood development. This is a figure ground of the existing condition today, the village here, industry here, and then the suburban growth on the other side. This is the interstate that goes through it. What's important about it is that it's the precise moment at which land use zoning was legislated. There's no doubt some people in the room that know more about vertical height zoning that occurred much earlier in New York City, for example. It's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about land use zoning, and its first legislated use occurred here. The important aspect of land use zoning is that there's a level of segregation of land uses. And this is important because there's segregation of land uses as well as classification of land uses themselves. What that means is that there is a planimetric division of lands, which by necessity and also by definition precludes systems traversing through it. However, what's interesting is that it starts to develop the modern era of separation of land uses where residential is separated from industrial. Remember, the late 1920s, we're in the beginning of the era of motorization, and highways start to neatly insert themselves in between different so-called incompatible land uses. Why is this important? Because this could look like it's anywhere across the North American continent. And if anybody ever says that this is disorganized, chaotic, unplanned, they're wrong. It's entirely designed, entirely planned, entirely controlled under those parameters that have been barely revisited since 1927. I'm not the one saying this. I'm citing Sidney Willem and a generation of other planners that have talked about the structural element of zoning itself as an important factor in planning, but also design. Now, before moving to these aspects of there's two things that we need to move into, which is issues of urbanization and regionalization that are occurring. Remember, at the 1920s, the turn of the 20th century, what's happening is that these cities are exploding. Some cities are doubling their population by decade, even quadrupling. One important text to bring in, and this sociological realization of what's occurring with the development of cities, is this text in 1938 by Lewis Wirth, sociologist, Urbanism as a Way of Life. What is important about this text is that there's an understanding very early on about the impact and shape that the country is taking on and the North American continent is taking on following the most important census in the history of the US, which is the 1920 census, the point at which America became urban. Now, there's tons of discussion throughout the world about becoming urban, but in fact, that was happening almost a century ago. It's important because it's that precise moment that architects, planners, and designers were actually putting urbanism itself as the focal point of discourse. Now, at two levels, we see the emergence, by virtue of urbanization, we see the emergence of a number of issues that come up, and this invention of systems that occur. Sanitary sewer systems, electrical systems, and traffic systems. I'll just go through this three very briefly. The underlying idea with sewage systems is with the prevalence of certain types of choleras and the mixing of sewage with supplies of water, namely, for example, in Chicago, where they were putting sewage into Lake Michigan, but also then drawing their water supply from there. And Chicago was important because it had the first system of separated sewage, which it means that they were actually separating out where they were getting the water from and also where the sewage was being dumped. An important figure in all this is George Waring. He'll become more and more important throughout the talk. George Waring was essentially really the grandfather of modern systems of separation. This is also important because in Europe, it wasn't happening. Cities were too dense, whereas in the US and in Canada as well, development had not been occurring yet. So therefore, the roads and the sewage systems could be established beforehand. There are exceptions, and I'm sure there's historians in the room that will that shun my generalizations here, but I hope the point will be well taken. The second aspect is the issue of traffic congestion itself. The advent of motorization, the absence of true codes or behaviors on roads brings up William Phelps Eno, self-declared traffic regulator, who starts to write up a series of behaviors and codes in cities, which essentially some of them boil down to just driving on the right side, or also, in its most sophisticated example, bringing in what could be considered a collective strategy of traffic regulation, which is the modern roundabout. The French are still fighting with the Americans about who invented what. But I think that's going to keep on going forever. He also starts to enlist a series of signage systems associated with those behaviors at different scales. I prefer, like this is one of my favorite one. Thank you, ma'am. Did a research project in Europe in terms of signage systems. Now, add up George Waring, William Phelps Eno in terms of their traffic developments, sanitary sewage systems. What we see appearing at the same time, and Buffalo being categorized as apparently the best planned city in the world, is that it actually is a collection of these remnants of what could be considered these essential systems that service urban populations. This is Joseph Ellicott's radio plan for Buffalo. On top of that, and this is why it's important, on top of that is overlaid Frederick Law Olmsted's Buffalo plan, but it's a Buffalo park system. However, this is misleading because in fact, it was much more than this. This was a collaboration between George Waring, the sanitary engineer, who was actually working with Frederick Law Olmsted at the same time. Here we have what is apparently couched as a parkway system that's entirely connected, but in fact what it is a traffic system with these roundabouts and roads, with drainage system associated with the pre-existing streams, drainage areas, associated sewage systems as well underlying this. On top of, for example, open space systems that are used as, for example, cemetery, today which is a golf course, drainage and water supply for neighborhood developments, and then sanitary, psychiatric hospital, asylum, sorry. Think of it. Here's a landscape architect actually working before the turn of the 20th century on the overlapping of different collective systems that support urban development. And it is at that precise moment that it becomes infrastructural, because it couples and bundles a number of these systems to be able to service these a greater public as opposed to one single property owner. Here's just some close-ups, and what I'd like to bring into evidence, and this is most of this is all evidence around which we can ask a number of questions, but also there's these series of roundabouts that were actually designed in the 1880s, before Eno claims to have actually invented the modern roundabout. In fact, it turns out, and we're trying to substantiate this, and in fact, Frederick Law Olmsted was the one that hired William Phelps Eno to design Columbus Circle, which is, of course, on the corner of Central Park in New York. And its significance is relevant today because it's one of the most robust parts of the city. You can see Buffalo College is right here. The Albert Knox Gallery is right down here, and then the highway that bisects it. This is the only change that's occurred, is this ring road that now goes through it. But it still holds up and is one of the most resilient parts of the city itself. This is a Soldiers Field Circle. If we now understand that there's this process of urbanization that has conditioned a certain level of infrastructure to be innovated, There's another series of innovations that occur in the 1920s, going into the 1930s and 40s, that also spawn a level of infrastructural innovation. There's a number of events that occur, starting to deal with, and this is mostly reactionary to a number of conditions. We find ourselves in the late 1920s, early 30s, Great Depression, the crash that occurs in 1929, 1930s into the 40s, the Dust Bowl crisis, which is essentially the rampant overuse of agricultural lands in the central, in the Midwest region. And there's a number of other systems that come into play, dealing both with food production, mobility, and as we'll see as well, a few other ones. What occurs at this moment is, as some of you may know, FDR, Roosevelt comes in as the new administration to pick up the pieces and the fallout of the Great Depression, where they're right into it. He develops what's called the New Deal program, which some of you may know extremely well, but he surrounds himself with a brain trust of planners, thinkers, economists, agricultural economists that start to develop ideas for him. I'd like for you to just take a look at the next following slides to be able to understand the range of scales at which those interventions are being proposed. The first one, dealing with dealing with the Dust Bowl, proposal by Dr. Raphael Zahn, who proposes this great shelter belt of 200 million trees to be planted at the foot of the Rockies, interspersed across this zone that was affected by the Dust Bowl that was implemented. The scale of thinking, continental scale thinking. Now, I realize that that some of you will also bring up the fact that that the New Deal, the brain trust associated with Roosevelt, is associated with a certain socialist leaning. I'd like to actually be able to revisit that and to put it into question whether or not that assumption is correct. What we also have happen at the level of mobility, in the 19-teens to 20s, we see the emergence of a public roads movement. Keep in mind something that we can barely conceive today. We have a series of private roads dominating the entire country, right? Private clubs, farmers, maintaining their own roads, and essentially those are geared towards getting food from the actual farm itself to the market, to the city. That's what roads were about, the relationship between city and agricultural lands. There was some intercity relationship, but not really that well developed. This public roads movement goes a little bit further. It goes a little bit further because there's a number of things that are happening. Yes, there's motorization that's occurring, development of combustion engine, but there's two other factors that occur. The development of refrigeration and the development of trucking. What that does is essentially expands the reach and distance of farms to city. So therefore contributes to their expansion. And this is taken from an excellent book from Walter P. Hayden from 1929 called How Great Cities Are Fed. I've yet to come across a book so clearly articulating the impact of certain technological developments on the shape of cities and productive areas. Now, of course, we all understand what is the terminal end goal of these public roads, and we see it as the national system of interstate and defense systems. However, and that was claimed by Eisenhower, who was lucky to inherit all the legwork that FDR had done during the New Deal, because in fact the system was called an interregional highway system. And this aspect of regionalism becomes more and more important with the work that FDR is involved in. The region itself as locus of planning, infrastructure development, as well as implementation, becomes more and more important. And so this piece of information is useful for us. Now, it's useful because we now go into another scale of intervention that FDR was involved in, which is these greenbelt towns. Often regarded as being these suburban developments In fact, the idea of the green belts was in fact much more sophisticated than this. In fact, it had nothing to do with being suburbs. And in this case, what we're looking at is, this is FDR actually looking at a master plan of green belt in Maryland, which is in fact in between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The thinking was that these urban developments could occur in between cities to develop inter-regional network. And that's an operative term to his work. Here's a plan of Greenbelt itself. The example is relevant because Greenbelt is thriving today and has enlarged, and is essentially a grouping of super blocks, roads, separated footpaths, service areas, inner courts, interior parks, as well as the infrastructural amenities, collective systems to support it. Water, disposal plant, research, as well as farms and allotment gardens, as well as hinging on the modern idea of circulation separation. This is often viewed as being a borrowing of Radburn, but is more likely a borrowing from the work of Central Park, and also based on a mission that FDR sent 3 people to the Soviet Union to look at socialist systems of planning. He sent a group of people on a mission in 1927 to go investigate systems of planning there. Now, as I mentioned before, there's often this dichotomy or contradiction between the idea of the planned and the unplanned, which is not unlike this depiction in the 1930s. But I'd like to ask this, in terms of revisiting it, whether or not we could see it as something a little bit different. This is one of the last examples that I'll bring in terms of the New Deal era and the work of FDR, which deals with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was an authority that was given regional, an organization that was given regional authority according to the boundary of its watershed across the states that it serviced and went through, and involved a number of different services from that watershed. The first one being reliant on power for defense, and then a series of other products coming from that, dealing with fertilizers to both electricity, navigation, as well as farming and water supply. Now, I just bring this to your attention. This diagram here, where there was a purposeful association and collaboration and cooperation between a federal entity dealing with the storage and the management of rivers, which would fall under public control, in association with natural storage on private lands. So this dissociation between the potential collaboration between a federal government, a regional authority, and private landowners is misleading, because in fact, it wasn't necessarily so. What occurs afterwards, as I mentioned, since FDR's legacy was cut short right before the end of the Second World War, and Eisenhower took over, essentially his claim was to the highway system, and in many respects we know the story of how that develops. I speak about it in greater length in another article called Synthetic Surfaces, that deals with the urbanization from motorization in the 1950s to the 1970s. I'd like to jump over that and try to be able to provide some background processes to get to today in terms of what's happening, so that we can understand what's occurring at this moment. Now that we have, let's say, the regional understanding of processes and needs for collective systems, there's a number of economic factors that come into play. And we're centering on the Great Lakes region here, the great cutover region, Wisconsin, Michigan, parts of Illinois, which are essentially completely cut over, 40 million acres cut down, really from the westward expansion. That's one phase of transformation that occurs in the Great Lakes region. Leveling the fields for agriculture and dynamiting the fields to get the stumps out.
We see the appearance of a number of different planners and ideologues coming in toward understanding how to reclaim these deforested lands. We start to see people like Benton Mackay. This is a regional diagram that was done for reforesting, but also resettling some of the areas that were cut down. This is Lake Superior, so Wisconsin, Michigan's down here. And then we see the appearance of Benton Mackay was working, of course, with the Forest Service, so he's working with Gifford Pinchot, also with P.S. Lovejoy. But simultaneously, during the 1920s and 30s, as these diagrams are being sketched out, we also have a Midwesterner entering into the picture, Frank Lloyd Wright. And we very often don't see them associated, but essentially he was working just outside of Chicago, putting together these other diagrams that were in fact not immune to the resettlement diagrams and reclamation projects that Benton Mackay and Lovejoy were involved in. However, his were more in response to his aversion, and I'll put that in brackets, to what was the industrial city. Another person to bring into the question here is the whole question of the city itself is being re-questioned by people like Jean Gottman, who was essentially brought over from Europe to be able to investigate a process that's occurring on the east coast of the U.S., not a process that's completely different from what's happening in Europe, is the amalgamation of different cities along the coast. He comes up and coins the word megalopolis to be able to understand how this urbanized landscape can be defined. It's defined amidst growing transformation that's occurring in the Great Lakes, where it becomes the manufacturing belt, Milwaukee being one of the many cities. But here's where we start to get a little bit closer to home. 1970s and 80s, we don't actually start to see the real effects of this type of urbanization because of a number of things. Because of the non-point sources of discharge of agricultural runoff and pesticides that are happening in the region. We don't see the slow breakdown of certain forms of infrastructure, such as roads that have a lifespan of 10 to 20 years, bridges that have a lifespan of 50 to 75 years. And so it slowly starts to emerge, these indications that there's a problem with these forms of urbanization. Aquatic species being indicators of potential issues related to water quality. This is taken from 1974 National Geographic. We begin to understand a system, or more systemically, how the watershed itself and groundwater resources are actually all interconnected with the actual land patterns on top. Now, this is no news to anybody today, but what's important about it is that there's a series of other indicators associated with it. Indicators such as the Love Canal site, which is just south of Buffalo. In 1970s, there's a late 1960s and early 70s, chemicals bubbling up through the work of Lois Mary Gibbs and her family, who raised advocacy about the problem. The white areas on the illustration shows the dead areas where there's all mineral content and chemical pollutants at the top. And the importance of the Love Canal example within this greater history is that it makes the critical link between the level of industrialization that was happening in the country as a result of militarization. This is Chemical Valley in Buffalo. Love Canal is right here, Buffalo is up here. And this is essentially the Niagara area is just over here. These are a series of hooker chemical sites that are Superfund sites. It is home to the largest concentration of Superfund sites in the U.S. But there's a problem with this recognition of these Superfund sites, which deals with the aspect of remediation. There's been Superfund money thrown at the remediation of these sites, but Love Canal itself, as being one of the first that actually triggered the development of the Superfund legislation, almost 30 years later, looks exactly the same. Houses been deconstructed, asphalt pads on top of them, asphalt pad on top of the school that was once there, and all we have evidence left is a fenced-in berm. There's a problem at which the pattern and morphology of urbanization cannot reconcile the industrial processes that are associated with it. There's literally a disjunct, and this is the turning point at which we understand, which there is an end, or at least there's an understanding that the linear, closed, fixed aspects of industrial systems of urbanization need to come to an end because of sites like these for which they can't reconcile. And what we see emerging more and more is the prevalence, and this is a timeline of a number of incidents that have grown over the past few decades, more and more over the past century, but now more prolific. There's many love canals that are occurring, and there's a reason for that. Actually, I'm going to jump over that slide and get directly to this one. There's an appearance of GIS that occurs to help our understanding. GIS itself being really an offshoot of the militarization of science, where essentially you had ballistic missiles that had to, during the Cold War, they had to understand the curvature of the Earth to be able to understand how the US was going to prevent and defend itself against any incoming missiles. And so GIS has its beginnings here. But GIS also had its other possibilities in terms of visualization, large scales, large regional scales. Now, this gets us very close to where we end the story. There's a turning point in the 1980s, and there's a reason for the prevalence of the number of incidents, accidents, failures, and that has to do with the beginning of the era of deregulation and de-investment of federal oversight of major infrastructural projects. Of course, there's Milton Friedman shaking hands with Ronald Reagan, who essentially, from the 1980s forward, that I would actually claim till today, has literally left a legacy of distrust in the federal government to be able to oversee these large-scale systems. What we see occurring from there is a higher incidence of infrastructural failure. Minnesota bridge collapse, just very recently, the ash spill. This is actually right beside a power plant inside the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was just because of a dike that wasn't maintained properly. So there is there's a number of things that we need to pay attention to, and I would argue the following in these last few slides. And the expansion of the Buffalo campus occurring there. That's one indicator on top of the failures and other accidents that are occurring. Other indicators. After 14 floodings, the historic group in charge of the Farnsworth House, designed by Mies van der Rohe, is now trying to conceive of a way to build a dike around the Farnsworth House to prevent it from flooding from the Fox River. This is a downstream urban problem that's occasioned by both the decrease of permeable surfaces as well as increasing incidences of high base flow in the watershed itself. It is a registration of those processes. What we're also seeing as penetrating into these watershed regions, we're seeing the invasion of different species, but I would argue that this is not necessarily a problem in terms of the issues of Asian carps, because in fact they are a delicacy for Europeans. So there's a number of aspects that I would like to bring into this discussion in terms of these indicators. That if we take a look at the compound history and involvement of the federal government at the regional level, as well as the relationship and cooperation that's happening at the ground level with private landowners, there was a moment at which there was a reciprocity that was occurring between landscape resources and collective systems of infrastructure. And there's 5 of them. We recognize them: waste, water, food production. This is the highest concentration of greenhouses in Ontario. Mobility. This is future projections. And energy. waste, water, energy, transport, and food. There are 5 collective systems that support urban economies that we have yet to truly address as a field. And I would argue the following, in terms of some of the developments that are occurring if we don't pay attention. There's a few developments occurring in terms of, I believe, changes that are occurring today. We're seeing certain forms of synergistic design occurring. Relationships of different land uses that are overlapping themselves. This is in Michigan, believe it or not. I mean, it looks like the most contemporary thing you've ever seen of these field of wind turbines across this agricultural grid of Michigan. It's developed by an ag division by John Deere Renewables, which is a division of John Deere Ag. Also, the understanding of systemic design and dualization of different infrastructures. This is a proposal by an organization for the doubling of a dike around New Orleans, which associated energy systems with transportation systems for flood protection. This is a photograph of Flint, which may not seem as the imminent future, but is the home of the first land banking authority in Michigan, which is being used as the organization, the precedent organization for future land banking across North America, as both a fiscal way of being able to replan industrial lands that have been abandoned. And then finally, the 2 last slides here is that we need to understand a level of regionalization that's associated with urban areas. This is simply a profile of the Great Lakes in section with the bathymetry of the 5 lakes and the cities that it supports. 40 quadrillion liters of water supporting almost 40 million people. And then finally, I think we need to engage a level of super planning. What I mean by this is a planning beyond this generation. A planning that goes to 2 to 3 generations, and the only way to do that is to be able to couple biophysical systems with processes of urbanization. I would argue that if we don't pay attention to this, I truly do believe that rather than us thinking that we are designing these systems for the future, I would actually argue that that future is going to design us. Thanks very much.
Questions will appear. Find the way back on the front.
I was just curious, there's a slide you showed about international land grabbing and the relationships that
Yeah.
Canada seemed to be missing from that slide. Is that a unique?
So if I can repeat the question was about the slide related to the global land grab research, why Canada is out of that picture, or doesn't seem to be implicated or involved. The research is ongoing. We're having difficulties finding information about it, but we're a little bit suspicious as to the reason why we haven't found that information. I'm naturally suspicious about that. Suspicious of the lack of information that's coming out of Canadian operations abroad, because there are a lot of them.
I want to follow up on your national suspicions, because,
Yeah.
I mean, I really appreciated the talk, and it was formatted, I would say, around the concept of a conspiracy theory, to show a kind of conspiracy of infrastructure over the late 19th and early 20th century. But what I'm trying to get my head around is to what end? Like who is the Illuminati in your set? Because you referred to a series of thinkers who clearly contributed to a thinking about infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what would you say would be the overarching ambition of that group? And then conversely, because you spoke mostly about failed attempts of the past, what would it be about the current conceptualization that would prevent those same difficulties
mentioned the question, if I understand the question properly, is that the talk was primarily about building conjecture about the idea of infrastructure, the thinkers' ideologies associated with them, as well as an understanding of how they may or may not have failed. And that essentially, how do we position ourselves, or to which constituency do we speak in terms of that understanding? Why is it relevant to us now?
No, I'm going to try
Yeah.
that. It's clearly relevant. Like,
Yeah.
I'm super convinced. I believe everything you said. There's basically a series of actors who are operating. And the way you present it is a kind of conspiracy. I don't know the aim of the original conspiracy. So to what end linked all those thinkers who may or may not have been in communication, there's a kind of image of the world that they were supporting. Conversely, in the current moment, you talk about a more integrated systemic approach. And what is the underlying conceptual paradigm that you think underwrites your vision of it? And how does this new paradigm actually not have the same difficulties of the one you previously identified?
Okay, I'll address the first question in the most simplest and practical way I could. When we revisit these historical facts, some of them are facts, some of them are interpretations, but some of them are generalizations. But there are some that are facts. There's also evidence to point towards some of that factual information. I believe that at some point, with the series of crises and failures that were occurring at the beginning of the 20th century that were brought up as a result of urbanization, that there was a series of strategies that were instigated, innovated, and developed. In this case, I just recounted what the New Deal and the FDR might have done, without being romantic about the New Deal, but that there was a scale of thinking associated with it. I believe that that scale of thinking and that project associated with the synergies and reciprocities possible between a federal level, between a regional level, and between an urban or local level, I believe that project was interrupted. And that's a key moment, and I appreciate the question to be able to clarify that. That project of infrastructure as a public regional asset and a public regional project was interrupted, in my opinion, by what was happening in the 1960s and 70s. Issues related to de-investment, deregulation, and general distrust in the government. Because and just being somewhat new to the country, I'm also getting familiar with the politics, the history. But that, in many respects, I'd like to pose the question whether or not that project of infrastructure as a field of intervention at these different scales might have been interrupted. And I believe it was actually taken hostage by the practice of civil engineering. And so if I can make that statement, I think that if we understand that there's a level of inertia of planning today, and I say that because planning is incapable of resolving some of these large issues, because there's a fundamental misunderstanding between zoning and planning. Zoning is not planning. Writing briefing documents for the future of communities is not planning. Planning is projecting, planning is envisioning, from my perspective. I believe that that level of projective thinking over large scales, magnitudes of time, should be reclaimed or claimed by designers because they have the ability, the unique ability, based on the visual language that they have, the tools, the instruments, but the operative thinking, to be able to instrumentally slide across the scales of planning and engineering. Planners can't do that because they're at the end of one spectrum. Engineers can't do that because they have a disciplinary myopia, which is self-affirmed. They don't deny that. But designers, what I'm trying to point out is that at this very precise moment, we are at a turning point at which these shifts are occurring, and there's all this evidence pointing in the direction for us to take charge and to take the lead, because nobody else is. Nobody else is. Does that answer your question?
Do you have a question in the back?
Yeah.
Hi, you spoke very briefly about local land wealth and the concept of the imperial style purchasing of land. For example, I think it was South Korea that purchased about a 99-year lease on 2% of arable land in Madagascar, perhaps. And so I'm just wondering what you have to say about this, what protections you think can be put in place internationally, since right now there's no management
Yeah.
to prevent this kind of predatory, if this result of starvation, there could be growing corn
Yeah.
shipped out on these cars.
Well, there's a great point in terms of what is our position vis-a-vis these transactions that are occurring between different countries, which it seems from your tone that these are dubious transactions as well. Is that a fair assumption? Okay, no, that's okay. I would say the way that at least I would answer that or position myself towards it is I believe that we first have to understand what's happening. And as much as a lot of people don't want to know what's happening, I think we're also, as designers, we are in a position to be able to shed light on these processes that are, they're not local, they're not regional, they're not just global, they're all over. And they go across those scales. And I think we're predisposed, because of our training, to be able to shed light on those. What do we do about them? I think there's two strategies we can adopt. The first, through the process of being able to be able to uncover what is occurring, that in itself can't be dismissed as an action itself. Extremely proactive, because the act of going to get the act of coalescing and bringing together all this information and synthesizing it to be able to understand it for the general public is extremely important. That necessarily forces us into a much more public role, which, if I can make a link to John's question about our public responsibility that we have right now. And if I can just add to a note to this, to your question, to both of your questions, is that I believe right now design has gone towards a direction leading or is in a territory of private practice. And that there are questions revolving that private practice and the nature of it, while there are major issues that could be said to be public or collective, or that address both ends, that have not been touched on. That's the first thing that I would say. I think the second thing that we would be able to then uncover from, let's say, this mapping project of exposing what's occurring, we would make the relationship also, and that goes with almost the final map that I put up there, is the relationship between patterns of urbanization along coastlines, which deal with urban morphology, and the relationship with hypoxic zones on the coasts. The patterns of urbanization, which necessarily establish a differentiation between their hinterland and the areas that provide food for these large urban agglomerations. And so the notion about the relationship between urbanization and food production then is suddenly brought into light. That if patterns of urbanization, it raises a question, which is, if patterns of urbanization today cannot address the demands for food by their very own populations and have to either jump watersheds to go into another country for water, right, where there would be a concurrent water wars map, or have to buy land into other countries to be able to produce their own food, perhaps we have to actually re-question the food production system and urban morphology. And I would argue that that puts into the question the industrial pattern of urbanization that has predominated essentially since the Romans up till the 21st century. And we are in a position to be able to notice a total restructuring of urban patterns at the moment.
Pierre, one more quick question. I appreciate your talk greatly. 2 points too, that cities, equally cities as a collection of land uses, is a legacy of the 19th and 20th centuries. I particularly love the map of Buffalo. When you zoom into what is supposedly the open space system, the park system, it is a collection of an insane asylum, a cemetery, and a driving park, and a wastewater or a stormwater collection system. This sort of dual legacy of conflation, of collection of land uses, doesn't give us an answer for what is the role of infrastructure today, nor what is the identity of cities today.
Well,
Question.
yeah.
Some of the slides you showed at the end pointed to, well, the answer, or the identity has to do with catastrophe that we brought upon ourselves. And then you showed a series of regionally scaled infrastructural works, which suggests that it's a reconciliation based on increasing the productive capacity of agricultural systems, energy systems. In all of this, it seems the biophysical, which you started with, continues to lose out. Am I reading that correctly? Do you see any salvation or any true reconciliation of the biophysical to the urban through the role of infrastructure today or in the future?
Well, I think it's I would say to the first question about the example of Buffalo and the conflation of these different infrastructures that are occurring there, and how do we position ourselves in terms of biophysical resources and systems. I would actually say that, first, that I'm not a catastrophic thinker. I'm not a Malthusian thinker in terms of that we'll run out of food and land space at all. In fact, I'm a great optimist and actually believe, not unlike Ford did, that we'll never run out of resources, ever. And I think there's a level of human ingenuity associated with that. I do think that there is a completely different role that we're going to enlist biophysical resources, less as resources, and actually more as systems. And that we'll see them less differentiated and less backgrounded by industrial forms of infrastructure or linear forms of infrastructure. And that in fact we'll start to consider ecology itself, the ecology of biophysical systems with constructed systems, as the infrastructure that we need to design. And I think and in many respects, it becomes perhaps less a question of design at one particular scale, and more of a question of the design of the planning of the strategies associated with how to couple those systems together. It looks very different.